The rain was relentless, hammering against the cracked window of the tiny apartment where Clara Bennett stood, clutching a pregnancy test. Two faint blue lines stared back at her, fragile as a whispered promise, yet heavy enough to shift the axis of her world. For a fleeting moment, joy flickered in her chest, a spark of the future she and James had dreamed of during late-night talks. Their hands intertwined, their voices soft with hope. A baby. A family. She imagined telling him tonight, maybe slipping the test into a small velvet box, or waiting until they were curled up on the couch, his laughter filling the room. But the warmth in her heart guttered like a candle in a storm when she heard the front door creak open. James walked in, his broad shoulders slumped, his dark hair damp from the rain. His face was a mask of something Clara couldn't quite read, guilt maybe or dread. Before she could speak, he set his keys on the counter with a deliberate clink and said, "We need to talk." His voice was low, sharp, like a blade slicing through the air between them. Clara's stomach twisted. She opened her mouth, the words "I'm pregnant" trembling on her lips, but he didn't give her the chance. "I've been thinking about this for weeks," he said, his eyes fixed on the floor. "The Susit's not working. I don't want to be tied down anymore." The room spun. Clara gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. "James, wait," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm pregnant." He froze, but not with the shock or tenderness she'd hoped for. His jaw tightened, and when he finally looked at her, his eyes were cold, distant, like she was a stranger he'd passed on the street. "That's your problem now," he said, turning away. "I didn't ask for this." In that moment, Clara's world shattered. The man she'd loved for 5 years, the man who'd promised her forever under a starlit sky, was walking out the door without a backward glance. She stood there, rooted to the spot, the pregnancy test still in her hand, as the sound of his footsteps faded into the rain. The days that followed were a blur of silence and despair. Clara sat on the edge of their shared bed, staring at the empty space where James's clothes used to hang. She kept expecting him to come back, to burst through the door with apologies and flowers, telling her it was all a mistake. But the apartment grew emptier by the day. First his jackets vanished, then his books, and finally the framed photo of them at the beach, laughing in the surf. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the ticking of the kitchen clock and the queasy churn of morning sickness. She tried to reach him, calls, texts, emails, but every attempt was met with nothing. Her messages floated into the void, unanswered, unread. The man who'd once sworn to stand by her side had disappeared, leaving her with nothing but a growing belly and a heart that felt like it was drowning. Worse still was the humiliation. Friends noticed James's absence and offered awkward condolences before drifting away. At work, her colleagues whispered behind their coffee cups, their eyes sliding past her in the break room. When she visited James's parents, hoping for some shred of support, his mother, Diane, barely opened the door. "We told him you weren't right for him," she said, her voice clipped. "You always seemed fragile." Clara stood on their porch, clutching her purse, fighting the tears that burned her eyes. "I'm carrying your grandchild," she said softly. Diane's expression didn't soften. "That's your burden now," she said, closing the door. Each rejection was a fresh wound, carving deeper into Clara's spirit. And as her bank account dwindled, the reality hit her like a physical blow. She was pregnant, alone, and broke. Bills piled up on the kitchen table unopened, a towering monument to her unraveling life. She tried to keep working at the small bookstore where she'd been employed for years, but the nausea and exhaustion made it impossible to keep up. Her manager, a kind but practical woman named Susan, began cutting her shifts. "We need someone reliable," Susan said, her smile tight with pity. Clara nodded, swallowing her devastation, and left the store with her head down. Food became a luxury. She stretched a single loaf of bread across days, rationing each slice, always saving the last bite for the life growing inside her. Her body ached, her heart throbbed, and her spirit frayed like a worn thread. The final blow came in the form of a white envelope taped to her apartment door. An eviction notice. She hadn't paid rent in 3 months. Clara stared at it, numb until the words blurred into a haze. That night, she packed a single suitcase, clothes, a photo of her late mother, a worn copy of Jane Eyre, and left the apartment she'd once called home. The city streets were unforgiving. the rain soaking through her thin coat as she wandered under flickering streetlights. Shelters were full, and the few friends she reached out to responded with vague excuses or silence. Exhausted, Clara found a park bench beneath a sprawling willow tree, its branches drooping like a curtain. She wrapped her coat tightly around her belly, lay down, and cried until her tears ran dry. The world had moved on, and no one came looking for her. Morning broke with a harsh gray light. Clara's joints ached from the cold bench, her stomach growled, and the baby kicked softly, a quiet reminder of her responsibility. She sat up, pressing a hand to her belly and whispered, "I'm sorry." Her voice cracked in the damp air. As she stood, a woman approached, her silver hair tucked into a loose bun, her arms wrapped around a basket of fresh bread. She was in her late 60s, her face lined with a quiet strength that didn't feel like pity. "You don't look like you belong out here," the woman said, her voice gentle but firm. Clara was too weary to muster pride. She lowered her head, unable to meet the woman's eyes. The woman, who introduced herself as Margaret, offered her a piece of bread and a warm smile. "I have a spare room behind my shop," Margaret said. "It's small but it's safe." Clara hesitated, her trust battered by betrayal. But something in Margaret's steady gaze made her nod. They walked together through the waking city, and Clara noticed how people greeted Margaret with warmth, calling her name as they passed. Margaret owned a second-hand shop called The Attic, nestled between a diner and a pawn shop. The store smelled of cedar and old books, its shelves crowded with vintage dresses, chipped teacups, and forgotten trinkets. The spare room was barely larger than a closet, with a narrow cot and a sink, but to Clara it was a lifeline. That night, she slept without fear for the first time in weeks. The weight of survival momentarily lifted. Life at the attic settled into a quiet rhythm. Clara helped Margaret with small tasks, dusting furniture, folding scarves, polishing brass candlesticks. The work was simple, grounding, and gave her mind a reprieve from the chaos of her past. Margaret asked few questions, but she always ensured Clara had a hot meal and a clean towel. "Everyone walks through dark seasons," Margaret said one evening, pouring tea from a chipped pot. "What matters is what you plant in them." Clara clung to those words, though she wasn't sure what she could plant in her barren season. Slowly, she began to feel useful again. Not just a broken woman hiding among relics. In the evenings, she and Margaret sat on the shop's small porch, watching the city hum with life. Margaret shared stories of her late husband, a painter who dreamed of galleries but settled for teaching art to children. "Life rarely follows the map you draw," she said, her smile tinged with old sorrows. Clara found solace in Margaret's resilience, a quiet strength that didn't demand perfection. But the past wasn't done with her. One afternoon, as Clara sorted a box of donated jewelry, a customer entered the shop, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a familiar tilt to her head. It was Lena, James's older sister. Clara froze, her hands trembling around a tarnished brooch. Lena's gaze lingered on her, recognition dawning. "Clara," she said, her voice a mix of surprise and discomfort. "What are you doing here?" Clara's throat tightened. "I work here," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. Lena's eyes flicked to Clara's growing belly, and her expression hardened. "James told me you were struggling," she said, her tone implying it was Clara's fault. "He's moved on, you know. You should too." The words stung, but Clara held her ground. "I'm not the one who ran," she said quietly. Lena's lips pursed, and she left without buying anything. The encounter left Clara shaken. A reminder that James's abandonment wasn't just personal, it was public. A story others were writing for her. As her pregnancy progressed, Clara's body grew heavier, her movements slower. Margaret noticed and began assigning her lighter tasks, like pricing books or arranging window displays. One day, while Clara was hanging a vintage shawl in the window, a young woman named Tessa entered the shop. She was in her early 20s with cropped hair and a nervous energy. "I saw your display," Tessa said, gesturing to the shawl. "It's beautiful. Did you design it?" Clara shook her head. "I just arranged it. The shawl's second-hand." Tessa's eyes lit up. "That's even better. It's like giving it a new story." The comment sparked something in Clara, a faint ember of creativity she hadn't felt in months. She and Tessa talked for an hour, swapping ideas about repurposing old fabrics. Tessa, an aspiring designer, offered to bring in some of her sketches, and Clara agreed, intrigued by the possibility of collaboration. Their partnership became a small lifeline. Tessa's sketches were bold, blending vintage textiles with modern cuts, and Clara's knack for storytelling brought them to life. They started small, stitching a few dresses from donated fabrics and displaying them in the shop. Customers noticed, and soon, the attic was drawing a new crowd, young, curious, and eager for unique pieces. Clara began posting photos of their creations on a makeshift social media page, captioning each with a short story about the garment's origins. "This blouse was once a curtain in a 1920s parlor," one post read. "Now it's ready to dance again." The posts gained traction, and the attic's dusty shelves began to feel like a stage. But Clara's peace was fragile. One evening, as she locked up the shop, she saw a familiar figure across the street. James. He was leaning against a lamppost, watching her. Their eyes met, and for a moment she thought he might approach. Instead, he turned and walked away, his silhouette swallowed by the city. The encounter left her rattled, her old wounds bleeding anew. Why was he here? What did he want? She didn't tell Margaret, but the older woman noticed her unease. "Ghosts don't haunt unless you let them," Margaret said, handing her a mug of chamomile tea. Clara nodded, but the ghost of James lingered, a shadow she couldn't outrun. Winter arrived, and with it, Clara's due date. Labor began on a frigid morning, a sharp pain ripping through her lower back as she swept the shop's floor. She gasped, clutching the broom, and Margaret was at her side in an instant. "It's time," Margaret said, her voice calm but urgent. She drove Clara to the hospital, holding her hand through the chaos of contractions. The delivery room was a blur of bright lights and hurried voices. Clara gritted her teeth, sweat soaking her brow, as the pain consumed her. Margaret stayed by her side, whispering, "You're stronger than this, sweetheart." Hours later, Clara let out a primal cry, and a new sound answered a baby's wail. It was a girl, tiny and perfect, with a shock of dark hair. Clara held her daughter to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She named her Lily after her mother, a name that felt like a promise of renewal. Margaret stood by the window, wiping her eyes, her smile radiant. That night, Clara didn't sleep. She watched Lily breathe, memorizing every flutter of her eyelids, every soft sigh. This was her purpose, her reason to keep going. But Lily's resemblance to James was undeniable. Her blue eyes, her dimpled chin, they were his, and each glance was a reminder of his betrayal. Clara refused to let it poison her love. "You'll look like him," she whispered to Lily, "but you'll never know his weakness." She vowed to raise her daughter with the strength James lacked, to shield her from the pain of abandonment. As spring bloomed, Clara threw herself into the attic. She and Tessa expanded their line, creating jackets from old quilts and skirts from repurposed linens. The shop's social media grew, attracting customers from neighboring towns. Clara began hosting small workshops, teaching women how to mend clothes or style outfits on a budget. One participant, a single mother named Rachel, broke down during a session, confessing she felt invisible after her divorce. Clara listened, then helped her choose a dress that made her stand taller. When Rachel returned a week later, beaming with a new job offer, Clara realized her work was about more than fashion, it was about restoring dignity. The attic's success caught the attention of a local journalist, who wrote a feature titled "The Attic," where old clothes find new souls. The article went viral and orders poured in. Clara hired Tessa full-time and brought on Rachel as a part-time assistant. Margaret, initially skeptical of the shop's transformation, began to see Clara's vision. "You're not just selling clothes," she said one evening. "You're selling hope." But hope was tested when James reappeared. It was a warm afternoon, and Clara was arranging a window display when he walked into the shop, his suit crisp, his smile practiced. "Clara," he said, his voice smooth but hesitant, "you've done well for yourself." She stiffened, her hands pausing on a velvet scarf. "What do you want, James?" He shifted, glancing around the shop. "I heard about your success. Thought maybe we could talk. About us. About the baby." Clara's blood ran cold. "There is no us," she said, her voice steady. "And you don't get to claim her now." James's smile faltered. I made a mistake, okay? I was scared. I want to make it right. You don't get to decide what's right, Clara said, opening the door. Leave. He hesitated, then walked out, but his presence lingered like a stain. That night, Clara sat by Lily's crib, her mind racing. Why was he back? Was it guilt or something else? She didn't trust him, but a small traitorous part of her wondered if he'd changed. The answer came weeks later, at a regional small business expo where Clara was invited to pitch the attic's vision. She arrived with a suitcase of samples and a nervous buzz in her chest. The venue was sleek, filled with polished entrepreneurs and sharp-eyed investors. Clara wore a tailored blazer she'd sewn herself, its fabric salvaged from a vintage coat. When her name was called, she stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding. My name is Clara Bennett, she began, her voice clear. 2 years ago I was pregnant, homeless, and abandoned. I thought I was nothing. But one act of kindness gave me a chance to rebuild. And now I'm here to give that chance to others. She spoke of the attic's mission: sustainable fashion, stories of resilience, a community of women lifting each other up. She showed her online platform, modest but growing, and outlined her plans for a larger workshop space. When she finished, the room was silent, then erupted in applause. Investors approached her, offering cards and praise, their eyes bright with interest. As she stepped off the stage, she saw him, James, standing in the crowd, his face unreadable. He was pitching his own startup, a tech platform for fashion logistics, all buzzwords and slick promises. Their eyes met and he approached, his smile tight. Impressive, he said. Didn't think you had it in you. Clara didn't flinch. I always did, she said. You just didn't see it. The expo marked a turning point. An investor named Victor Lang, a retired textile magnate, approached Clara with an offer to mentor her. He saw potential in the attic, not just as a boutique, but as a brand with global reach. You're not selling clothes, he told her. You're selling transformation. Victor's guidance was rigorous but kind, pushing Clara to think bigger: supply chains, e-commerce, partnerships with ethical manufacturers. She spent nights studying, filling notebooks with ideas, driven by a fire she hadn't known she possessed. Meanwhile, James's startup faltered. His pitch, though flashy, lacked substance, and investors began to pull away. Rumors spread that he'd overstated his platform's capabilities, and his name became a cautionary tale. Clara heard whispers of his struggles but kept her focus on the attic. She didn't need revenge, her success was enough. Then came the letter. It arrived at the shop, slipped under the door, in an envelope with James's mother's handwriting. Inside, Diane confessed that James's departure hadn't been entirely his choice. His father, a wealthy but controlling man, had threatened to disinherit him if he stayed with Clara. I begged him to fight for you, Diane wrote, but he was weak. I'm sorry. The letter included a check for $5,000, labeled for the child. Clara stared at it, her hands shaking. The money could help, but it felt like blood money, a bribe to erase guilt. She tore up the check and burned the pieces in the shop's fireplace, watching the ashes scatter. James tried again, this time with a formal proposal. He sent a lawyer to the attic, offering a partnership between his floundering startup and Clara's thriving brand. He believes your visions align, the lawyer said, sliding a contract across the counter. Clara didn't touch it. Tell him I build with trust, not convenience, she said. The lawyer left and Clara felt a weight lift. She didn't need James's validation, she never had. The attic, now rebranded as Haven, grew beyond Clara's dreams. She opened a second location, partnered with a women's shelter to offer job training, and launched a line of upcycled accessories. A national magazine featured her in its Women of Impact issue, with a cover photo of Clara and Lily in a sunlit garden. The headline read, Haven, Stitching Strength from Scars. The response was overwhelming: letters from survivors, mothers, and young women who saw themselves in Clara's story. One evening, as Clara prepared for a TED Talk, Lily, now 6, asked, Does my dad ever think about me? Clara knelt, holding her daughter's hands. But I think about you every day, and that's what matters. Lily smiled, content, and Clara realized she'd rewritten their story not by erasing the past, but by building a future stronger than its pain. Years later, Clara stood on the TED stage, her voice steady, her heart full. My name is Clara Bennett, she began, and once I was left with nothing but a broken heart and a child to raise. But that's not where my story ends, it's where it begins. She spoke of resilience, of choosing courage over comfort, of finding strength in the ruins of betrayal. As she finished, the audience rose, their applause a wave of affirmation. Backstage, Lily ran into her arms and Clara whispered, "We made it." Somewhere in the crowd, James watched, a shadow of the man he'd been. He'd posted an apology online, admitting his failures, but Clara didn't respond. Forgiveness wasn't a wed, it was earned, and she'd found her peace without him. Her story wasn't about what she'd lost but what she'd built. A legacy of hope, a daughter who'd never know abandonment, and a life that shone brighter than the darkness it had overcome.
If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.